It's a story that has sparked vigorous debate, even outrage in some. Welcome back to this special edition of 16 by 9. I'm Jennifer Tryon. When we first aired Annette Corriveau's story, we heard back from thousands of people with varying, passionate opinions. Some were very sympathetic and supportive. Others downright furious and staunchly opposed to the idea of euthanasia or that killing could ever be merciful. Here today to further the discussion is a group with many beliefs on the topic, and joining me in studio to talk about it is Margot Somerville, a professor of ethics and law at McGill University, and Amy Hasbrook is the disability rights activist and chair of Not Dead Yet, an organization that opposes the legalization of assisted suicide. And Wayne Sumner is a professor of ethics at the University of Toronto. And last but not least, Joan Gilmore is a professor at Osgoode Hall, and she specializes in disability rights. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being here. So no matter what side of the table you sit on here, the topic of euthanasia, and especially Annette Corriveau's story, is certain to evoke some sort of response. Amy, let's start with you. Is this mercy or is this murder?
My feeling is that this is murder, and this is not an individual case, that this is an example of the devaluation of people with disabilities.
Now, let's ask Joan, because you actually specialize and advocate for the rights of the disabled, yet do you believe this is murder or mercy?
I believe that this is wrong, and I think that Annette Corriveau would be incorrect in saying that she could simply withdraw a feeding tube. She has to make those decisions in the children's best interests, but she's not simply at liberty to decide what best interests may be.
But she's their mother.
She is their mother.
Who else would it be?
She is the decision maker, but she does so subject to some constraints in terms of what best interests are. It's a different situation than the one that Arthur Schaefer discussed on that show when he was talking about people who really are at the end of life. These two are not at the end of their life.
So does this mean, I mean, you say that this is not a unique circumstance.
No, it's not.
But Margot, what do you think?
No, it's not a unique circumstance. And what I see is the underlying issues there. Do you respect human beings simply because they're human beings, and that all human beings have got a right to respect for their lives? And if you look at that film, all of the talk is about what those children could or couldn't do. And then you say, well, your life is not worth living. I mean, it's appalling. It's absolutely appalling.
Physicians, family members, the public in general devalue the lives of people with disabilities, and it is only people like me who have disabilities and those of us who fight on behalf of people with disabilities who understand that our lives have equal value. And if this conversation concerned black people or women or gay people, we wouldn't even be having this conversation.
Is that true?
It wouldn't be appropriate.
I don't think they're parallel situations at all, but the point I was trying to make was the reason I think this doesn't really make a case for euthanasia is if you look at countries in the world in which euthanasia is legal, like the Netherlands, there is no way in which euthanasia would be legal under these circumstances because you require...
That's not right, Wayne. The Groningen Protocol allows parents now in the Netherlands, if they have a disabled baby, they can choose to have their disabled baby given a lethal injection.
Right, and that's been the practice allowed even before the time that euthanasia was legalized in the Netherlands, and it is a very common practice even up to now. The National Disability Rights Network in the United States has just released a report stating how common it is for treatment to be withdrawn or withheld.
But treatment being withdrawn and feeding tubes being removed, that's legal in Canada.
I agree with Joan. I don't think it would be acceptable in this case. It's legal under certain circumstances. There are relatively clear cases in which substitute decision makers can refuse treatment on behalf of the people for whom they're making decisions. So we have here a pair of children who are obviously incapable of making their own health care decisions. Furthermore, you also can't represent what they would have wanted because they were never in a position to make any decisions about their health care. So you have to act in their best interest as a substitute decision maker. I think there are certain cases, and Arthur Schaefer mentioned one of them, cases of a permanent vegetative state, permanent unconsciousness, where you can make the decision that continuing health care is no longer in the interest of the patient or is no longer of any benefit to the patient. and the decision can be made, I think, both ethically and legally to withdraw care in those cases, and that has been supported by the courts. But this is not one of those cases. I don't think in this case we have a clear case at all.
So under what circumstances, Joan, do you feel a parent or a substitute decision maker should be able to make that decision?
It would be a different situation, I think, if you were talking about a cancer patient and, say, someone who is in extreme and unrelievable pain. Okay? So first I should make it clear that I believe that if somebody can make decisions for themselves, I do support legalizing assisted suicide for people who can make decisions for themselves. That doesn't apply to this situation that we've just seen at all.
So who would make a decision here?
Nobody, because you don't want somebody deciding to kill somebody else.
The problem of unrelieved pain is not the problem of medical science. It is a problem of medical practice. And doctors don't offer pain relief as they should. And people don't know that the doctors are not offering. They think that what doctors offer is all there is, and don't know enough to advocate and to have to push until they get appropriate pain relief.
So what options are there for people that may be facing this situation or have relatives that you know what I mean?
So the first thing I'd point out is that we've got to recognize what our basic assumptions are. And my assumption is that that's wrong, that the law has what's called a presumption in favor of life, and anybody who wants to contravene that has to prove that they're justified in doing so. And I think what Amy and I are arguing is that a parent's judgment about a child's quality of life doesn't justify them in having that child killed. You can best judge what we call the ethical tone of a society, not by how it treats its strongest, most powerful, most privileged members, but how it treats its weakest, most vulnerable, most in need people. And that's what we're talking about. What do we owe to them? And I think that the fundamental thing we owe to them is respect for their lives.
I don't want to presuppose that continued life is always in the best interest of the patient. That's why I think that these are difficult decisions. I think Annette Corriveau's situation with those two children is one in which it's reasonably clear that she doesn't have a case even for withdrawing treatment, let alone some more active intervention. But there are cases in which a reasonable person might decide exactly the opposite.
Can I just say that when you look at the research, the two major reasons for people wanting euthanasia are a feeling of social isolation, a fear of being abandoned, what the late Dr. J. Katz called intense pre-mortem loneliness, and the other one is the fear of being a burden on others and on your family.
That's not true. Those aren't the major considerations. Those are on the list. No, they're not.
What do you think
They're not. No, they over and over again, the major considerations at the top of the list are loss of independence, loss of control over my own life, inability to do the things that give my life meaning. And these are people who are making, by the way, these decisions about their own lives. They're not making decisions about anybody else's life.
So should parents never be allowed to make that decision for a child that doesn't have that capacity? Does it need to be in conjunction with a medical team? Does it need to be a democracy, so to speak? I know you both think it shouldn't be,
but I
period.
mean, you sort of, you're putting on all these justifications. Let's ask the basic question. Should parents have a right to kill
their
their
children?
kids? That's right. That's the question.
What is it?
Not putting it, well, it's okay if we have a medical team, it's okay. And
Well,
the
I mean,
answer
he's
is
making the
no,
point,
they
he's
don't.
making the point that a parent shouldn't have that.
If they have the right to refuse treatment for their children under certain circumstances, and if we think that that is actually a justified decision in some circumstances, then they are basically deciding that their child will die. And then
But
the
they're not
question,
killing
then the question just becomes how, right? There are different ways of doing it. One is to withdraw feeding, in which case the child will die slowly. Or the other option is euthanasia, in which case the child dies quickly. I don't see any significant ethical distinction between those two, except that the latter sounds more humane. But the parents are in a position already to make life or death decisions for their children.
I want to give everyone the chance to make one last point about whether or not, I mean, obviously we know, which side of the argument you're on. But if there's an impression you want to give people watching that they may not understand about this issue, what would that be, Amy?
My what I'd like to say is that people with disabilities need to be heard in these discussions. A majority of people who face assisted suicide are people with ongoing disabilities and are not treated equally in the provision of suicide prevention treatment solely on the basis of their disability.
Margot.
Yeah, the question in this whole debate is not if we're going to die. We're all going to die, and we've got to face that. The question in this debate is how we die. And what I argue for is that when death occurs naturally, which can happen, as Wayne says, because you've decided further treatment is medically futile, it's still a natural death. What I don't think we have the right to do, and what I think would be disastrous for society if we legalized killing, and I think an extreme example of that would be parents having the right to kill their children. Shocking.
Wayne.
I think there is and ought to be a legitimate debate in the country about whether to legalize assisted suicide or euthanasia. So we're talking about voluntary euthanasia, not about making these decisions for others. I think there's a strong case for legalizing assisted suicide or euthanasia in this country, but this case is an extreme outlier. I would not say that this makes any such case at all.
Joan.
I agree with Wayne on that point. And in terms of something to bear in mind, I think we have to be very aware of that distinction between people who are able to make their own decisions and people who are not, and understand that when we make decisions for others in their best interests, we're not entirely free just to say, well, that's our view of what the best interests are.
I'd like to thank you all for being here. You've definitely contributed more to this discussion, and we appreciate that. If you'd like to see the program again or get more information on our panelists and the organizations that they belong to, you can visit us online at www.global16by9.com. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Disability rights activist and chair of Not Dead Yet, an organization that opposes the legalization of assisted suicide. And Wayne Sumner is a professor of ethics at the University of Toronto. And last but not least, Joan Gilmore is a professor at Osgoode Hall, and she specializes in disability rights. Welcome to you all. Thank you for being here. So no matter what side of the table you sit on here, the topic of euthanasia, and especially Annette Corriveau's story, is certain to evoke some sort of response. Amy, let's start with you. Is this mercy or is this murder?
My feeling is that this is murder, and this is not an individual case, that this is an example of the devaluation of people with disabilities.
Now, let's ask Joan, because some were very sympathetic and supportive. Others downright furious and staunchly opposed to the idea of euthanasia or that killing could ever be merciful. Here today to further the discussion is a group with many beliefs on the topic, and joining me in studio to talk about it is Margot Somerville, a professor of ethics and law at McGill University, and Amy Hasbrook is the actually specialize and advocate for the rights of the disabled. Yet, do you believe this is murder or mercy?
I believe that this is wrong. And I think that Annette Corriveau would be incorrect in saying that she could simply withdraw a feeding tube. She has to make those decisions in the children's best interests, but she's not simply at liberty to decide.
It's a story that has sparked vigorous debate, even outrage in some. Welcome back to this special edition of 16 by 9. I'm Jennifer Tryon. When we first aired Annette Corriveau's story, we heard back from thousands of people with varying, passionate opinions.